Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This seat isn't for people like you." Rachel Foster's voice, cold and razor-sharp, rang out across the first-class cabin as 100 eyes swung toward Charles Remington. The sound of her words hung in the air, louder than the engine rumble outside Gate 19 at JFK. Then, with a practiced flick, she tore Charles's boarding pass in two, letting the halves flutter to the carpet at his feet. The entire row seemed to freeze. Gregory Shaw, dressed in a silk tie and the smugness of a man who'd never heard no in his life, piped up from across the aisle. "I told you that seat's reserved for our regulars. You should know your place." Someone snapped a photo. A woman in pearls tried to look away, but failed. Charles felt the sting before the pain could even settle. Public humiliation in the full glare of the first-class elite, the rain tapping on the windows outside felt warmer than the chill inside. Have you ever seen someone kicked out of a seat they paid for just because they didn't look the part? Tonight, Charles was that man. Tonight, the world would be watching. But in that instant, Charles Remington did not raise his voice. He didn't plead. He simply straightened the old Navy suit he'd worn through 100 meetings and 1,000 storms, stooped to pick up the torn ticket, and met Rachel's gaze head on. There was no apology in his eyes, only a quiet kind of pride, battered but unbroken. He thought of Greenwich, Connecticut, his home for 30 years. He pictured the silent mornings, his wife's voice in the kitchen, the old Navy medals lined up on the mantel. He remembered every battle that had taught him silence could be sharper than any sword. Rachel, undeterred, stepped closer, her badge catching the fluorescent light. "We have other guests waiting, sir, please. Don't make this harder." The shame burned deeper than anger. He'd faced down men with guns, with power, with money, but nothing ever quite stung like being told, at 69, with a lifetime of service behind him, that you simply didn't belong. A murmur swept through the cabin. Charles caught snippets. "Isn't he too old? He's nobody." Rules are rules. He let their words wash over him, then fade. Pride, he told himself, always pride. He looked back at Rachel and, voice low but steady, said, "You'll remember this moment." Rachel's jaw set. "Security will assist you." Before he could reply, 2 security staff appeared, as if conjured from the gloom, standing just close enough to make it clear. This wasn't a request. Gregory leaned back, already opening his Wall Street Journal, his seat reclaimed without a fight. "Let's keep first class for those who've earned it, right?" he announced, never looking Charles in the eye. Charles didn't answer. He simply picked up his duffel bag, worn at the handles, military issue a lifetime ago, and allowed himself to be escorted down the aisle. He never glanced back. There would be time for anger later. For now, all he could do was hold on to the last shred of dignity he had left, even as it was stripped away, piece by piece, in front of strangers who'd already decided he didn't matter. As the doors of the first-class cabin closed behind him, Charles felt the old pain, familiar but never welcome. But somewhere beneath the humiliation, a colder resolve was forming. One call, he thought. Just one call and everything changes. Tonight, they'd taken his seat. Tomorrow, they'd learn just who Charles Remington really was. Charles stood in the tight space just outside the first-class curtain, his duffel slung over one shoulder, ticket halves clutched tightly in his fist. The automatic doors hissed shut behind him, leaving him alone in the dim light of the galley. Behind the curtain, the murmurs of first class swelled. Curiosity, judgment, a little gossip on a rainy night. He leaned against the cool metal wall, fighting the urge to retreat further into himself. In 30 years of traveling, he'd never been ejected from a seat he'd paid for. He could still feel the humiliation prickling on his skin, raw and fresh. Even here, away from their stares, he knew the looks would linger in his memory. The curtain behind him parted a crack. Through the gap, Charles saw Rachel speaking in low tones to another flight attendant, her expression tight with irritation. Gregory Shaw, already sprawled in Charles's old seat, laughed too loud at some joke, his voice rising above the rest. "Some people just don't get it," he said, shaking his head, then clinked glasses with the woman beside him, who wore pearls and a practiced air of indifference. Charles caught the woman's eye as she glanced up from her magazine. For a moment, their gazes locked. Her eyes cold, appraising, a little too long on his worn suit, his silver hair, the duffel bag with faded initials. She turned away, lips pressed in a tight line. It was the look he knew well, not one of us. The flight attendant at the galley counter, young, a little nervous, kept glancing over, pretending to busy herself with coffee pods. "Sir, can I get you some water while you wait for further instructions?" she offered, voice polite but unsure. Charles shook his head. He wanted nothing more than to disappear. The moments stretched. Two businessmen in business class leaned into the aisle, craning for a better view. One snapped a photo with his phone, quick and furtive. The other whispered, "Is that the guy who got kicked out of first?" Their eyes flicked to Charles, then quickly away. A memory flashed in his mind. Years earlier, his first night at Annapolis, standing alone in a crowded hall, the feeling of being out of place, unwelcome. Back then, he'd learned to carry himself taller, to move through the world as if he belonged. But tonight, all the old lessons felt far away. Tonight, he felt exposed, outnumbered, and older than ever. Behind the curtain, the voices grew louder, Rachel's words clear and clipped. "We have to keep standards. If we let one slip, the regulars complain. You saw how he looked." "Bet he can't even afford the ticket," Gregory chimed in, louder. "Maybe he's on some charity voucher. Airlines give those out all the time now. Lowers the tone." Laughter, sharp, mean, the kind that's meant to sting. Charles closed his eyes. He could have stormed back in, demanded an apology, called the pilot, raised his voice, but that was never his way. Instead, he let his jaw clench and waited. Every second felt like an hour. Every muttered word a fresh slap. From somewhere down the aisle, a girl, maybe 20, maybe a college student, looked over at Charles with uncertain kindness. She started to step forward, but Rachel blocked her with a wave, her voice sweet and poisonous. "Thank you, but we have this under control. Please return to your seat." The girl hesitated, then sat, shooting Charles an apologetic glance. He turned away, heart thudding. He was no stranger to being overlooked. In boardrooms, in military briefings, there was always someone eager to explain why a man like him didn't quite fit the mold. But at least there he'd had a voice. Here, he had only silence and the sting of old wounds reopening. A few minutes later, the plane's ground manager appeared, clipboard in hand, tie askew from the rain outside. He looked Charles over, checked his badge, then lowered his voice. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir. There's been some confusion. Please wait in the lounge. We'll get this sorted." But Charles heard the note in his voice, a sorry that meant move along. A careful apology, just enough to sound official, not enough to matter. He nodded, gathered what dignity he had left, and walked down the jet bridge. With every step, he felt the eyes of strangers on his back, some curious, some indifferent, none willing to speak up. At the end of the hall, he paused and looked back through the glass at the first-class cabin, bright and distant now. He remembered the young woman's kindness, the only flicker of decency all night, and felt a mixture of gratitude and regret. He pressed his palm to his chest, feeling the old navy pin through the fabric. "I've stood taller and harder storms," he whispered to himself. "I will again." As he disappeared into the lounge, Charles knew the fight wasn't over, but for the moment he carried the burden of every silent man who'd ever been told they didn't belong, and every bruise left by the eyes of those who looked right through him. Charles found an empty seat in the airline's quiet lounge, a far cry from the velvet and champagne of first class. Here, the lighting was soft but tired, casting long shadows across the rows of worn leather chairs and sleeping travelers. He set his duffel down and sat heavily, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The torn boarding pass still trembled in his hand. He stared at it for a long moment. Two useless scraps of paper that should have meant comfort, status, respect. Instead, they felt like a ticket to nowhere. He looked at his reflection in the black window pane. The night rain blurred his features, but he could see the familiar gray hair, the lined face, the eyes that had watched too much of the world to be easily surprised. Yet tonight, humiliation stung deeper than he'd expected. As the minutes dragged, Charles's mind drifted unbidden to a younger version of himself. Brash, raw in his navy dress blues, standing at attention on the deck of the USS Constellation. He was 19, nervous as hell, on his first big assignment. The captain had barely looked at him, a nobody among the ranks, the kind of recruit nobody expected much from. He remembered the first time he'd been put in his place. He'd been caught in the wrong corridor during an inspection. An officer, white gloves gleaming, had dressed him down in front of everyone. Loud, public, not a shred of mercy. "You don't belong here, son. Maybe you should stick to cleaning decks." He'd swallowed his pride, saluted, and walked away, eyes burning with shame. But he hadn't quit. That night, alone in his bunk, Charles made himself a promise. Never let someone else decide your worth. Never let public shame dictate who you become. Decades later, he still lived by that creed. Tonight, in the sterile calm of the airport lounge, he reached up and touched the old Navy pin on his lapel. He remembered the men he'd served with, some gone now, some still sending Christmas cards. They were the sort of men who'd have his back in a foxhole, no matter his rank or last name. He wondered what they'd say if they could see him now, pushed out of a seat he'd paid for by people who measured worth in tailored suits and frequent flyer miles. Maybe they'd be angry on his behalf. Maybe they'd just shake their heads and remind him, "There's dignity in how you carry yourself when nobody's watching. That's what makes you a Remington." Charles felt the old steadiness returning. He squared his shoulders and tucked the torn ticket into his wallet, not as a memento of shame, but as a quiet reminder. This isn't the first time the world tried to make you smaller. It won't be the last. What matters is how you answer. He looked around the lounge. No one paid him any mind. A little girl dozed against her mother's side. A businessman barked into his phone about missed connections. Life moved on, indifferent to his small drama. But Charles knew that every person here carried their own invisible burdens, their own stories of being left out or looked over. He drew out his phone, opened an old group chat labeled Navy Boys. It had been months since anyone sent a message, but tonight he typed a short note. "Just got kicked out of first class. Some things never change. Still proud. Still standing." He hesitated, then hit send. Within minutes, replies buzzed in. "Damn right you are. Some folks never learn, Chuck. You buy the first round when you're back." He smiled, the first real smile since the ordeal began. There was comfort in knowing he wasn't truly alone. Not really. His phone vibrated again. A new message, this one from his wife, Marjorie. "Call me when you land. I'll have your favorite stew waiting. Proud of you, as always." He swallowed the lump in his throat. Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle, streaking the glass with silver. Charles let his gaze drift. calm settling over him like an old familiar blanket. He had survived worse than this. He'd survived war, loss, and the slow ache of getting older. He would survive this too. Somewhere in the depths of his soul, pride pushed out the shame. He was Charles Remington. He'd earned every stripe, every scar, every right to hold his head high. If tonight was a test, he'd pass it the only way he knew how, by keeping his dignity, refusing to bow, and waiting for the moment when the world would see the man behind the suit. As midnight crept across the tarmac, Charles sat in the lounge, eyes clear, spirit unbroken. The storm wasn't over, but he was ready. Whatever came next, he would meet it head-on, with honor and with the quiet strength of a man who'd never let the world define him. Have you ever been told you didn't belong or felt smaller than you truly are? If you have, share your story below. Because sometimes the quietest battles shape us the most. And you never know who your courage might inspire. The lounge felt colder now, the distant drone of intercom announcements barely registering in Charles's mind. Every few minutes the doors would hiss open and close, letting in hurried passengers, airline staff, and the tired shuffle of a late-night airport. Charles sat upright, duffel in his lap, back straight as if on parade, an old habit from years of military life. The torn boarding pass, now tucked away in his wallet, felt like a splinter he couldn't shake. He'd thought the worst of it was behind him, but humiliation has a way of echoing. It clings to you long after the crowd has moved on. From across the lounge, he saw Rachel Foster striding down the hallway toward the staff office. She didn't glance his way, but her posture was stiff, her steps clipped and purposeful. A few moments later, a uniformed security officer approached, pausing just in front of Charles. "Mr. Remington?" the officer asked, tone professional but distant. Charles nodded. The man didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a hand. Instead, he looked past Charles, already checking his clipboard. "There's a policy for these situations, sir. We'll need you to move to the general waiting area until we can arrange alternate accommodations. It won't be first class, but we'll do our best to get you home." He spoke as if reading from a script, not meeting Charles's eyes. Charles recognized the pattern. Polite words, no warmth. Just a bureaucratic solution to a human problem. It was easier, he supposed, to see him as a case number than a man. A ripple of attention spread across the lounge as Charles gathered his things. He caught snippets of hushed conversation. Is that the guy? What did he do wrong? Maybe he caused a scene. In moments like this, truth gets lost in whispers. He kept his head high, even as the security officer escorted him through the maze of chairs and blinking flight monitors. Travelers stared, some openly, others with a sideways glance. A businessman with a loosened tie gave Charles a pitying look, then buried himself back in his phone. An older woman, hair perfectly coiffed, clucked her tongue and shook her head, as if to say, "Some people just don't know their place." Charles felt the burn of a dozen judgments. He was used to scrutiny. He'd lived a life under the eyes of superiors, subordinates, and the public. But this was different. There was no dignity in this performance, no meaning to the ritual. Here, he was just an inconvenience, an error to be corrected. The general waiting area was a world apart from the plush hush of first class. Hard plastic chairs lined up beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, vending machines humming in the corner. A toddler cried somewhere in the distance. A college kid dozed with her backpack hugged tight. Charles took a seat by the window, staring out into the dark, rain-slicked tarmac. Every muscle in his body ached from tension and fatigue, but he forced himself to stay upright. To slouch now, he thought, would be surrender. A memory surfaced. An exercise from his Navy days when he and his fellow sailors had been ordered to stand in formation for hours during a surprise inspection. He remembered the ache in his legs, the sweat trickling down his spine, the urge to give in. But he'd held his ground, refusing to break before his superior's gaze. Tonight, there was no captain watching, no fellow sailors to catch him if he stumbled. But the principle was the same. You don't quit. Not when it's hard. Not when they want you to. He repeated it silently, the words steadying him as the minutes ticked by. A pair of airline staffers passed by, laughing over something on a phone. As they drew near, one nudged the other and whispered, "That's him, the guy from first class." The other looked Charles up and down, then snickered. The humiliation felt fresh again, as if the last hour had changed nothing at all. Charles pressed his lips into a thin line, refusing to let them see his pain. He'd spent a lifetime learning how to keep his face still, to hold himself together no matter what storms he faced. Then, from the far end of the waiting area, the young woman from the plane, the one Rachel had blocked, approached with hesitant steps. "Sir?" she asked gently. "Are you okay?" He looked up, surprised by her kindness. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, voice quiet but clear. She bit her lip. It wasn't right what they did. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know how. Charles gave her a small smile, warm despite everything. "You noticed. That's more than most." She nodded, lingered for a moment, then hurried away, cheeks flushed. Her words stayed with him. Even in a crowd that chooses to look away, sometimes someone cares, and sometimes that's enough to keep standing, just a little bit taller. Charles turned his gaze back to the window, watching the storm roll past, feeling the old pain turn slowly into something like resolve. There was still dignity left, even here at the edge of defeat. Have you ever been pushed aside or made to feel invisible, even when you did nothing wrong? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes a little kindness, or even just being seen, makes all the difference. The storm outside was losing its fury, but inside Charles something colder and sharper had settled. Humiliation was still there, a dull ache under the skin, but it no longer controlled him. Instead, a sense of purpose filled its place, steady and deliberate, as if every slight and sidewise glance had only steeled his resolve. He sat quietly by the window of the general waiting area, listening to the hush of tired travelers, the hum of vending machines, and the distant echo of flight announcements. He looked down at his phone, the old model with a cracked case and a sticker from his granddaughter. Charles had never cared for flashy upgrades. He valued what worked, what lasted. That, he knew, was why so many people underestimated him. He scrolled through his contacts to a name that wasn't marked with a title or even a last name. It simply read, Evelyn, home base. He hesitated only a moment before pressing call on the first ring. Evelyn Grant answered, her voice calm and sharp as ever, even at this late hour. "Charles, I saw the news alert from Blue Wing's security feed. Are you all right?" Charles took a breath. "I'm fine. Or I will be." "Evelyn, we need to activate Red Protocol, effective immediately." A pause on the line, but no surprise. "You're sure?" she asked. He nodded, then realized she couldn't see him. "Yes, Blue Wing crossed the line tonight. Not just with me, with Remtech, with our values." Evelyn didn't argue. She never did, not when it came to matters of principle. "Understood. I'll initiate the lockout sequence. All Remtech security systems connected to Blue Wing Air and its subsidiaries will go dark. I'll notify the board, legal, and the federal contacts. Send a courtesy alert to Skypulse," Charles added, voice low but steady. "Let them know we're open to transferring support, pending their review of our equity and ethics standards." "Copy that," Evelyn replied. "Do you want to issue a statement?" "Not yet," Charles said. "Let the facts speak first." He ended the call, letting the phone rest heavy in his palm. There was no rush of triumph, no satisfaction in retaliation. This was business. No, More than that, it was the silent line between dignity and surrender. For years, Charles had done everything possible to avoid pulling this particular lever. Tonight, there was simply no other way. Outside, the rain slowed to a steady drizzle. Charles watched the airport staff hustling across the tarmac, their movements frantic as messages no doubt began pinging through the Blue Wing control system. Within minutes, Evelyn's actions would freeze every Remtech-managed security door, surveillance network, and data node tied to the airline. Planes wouldn't move, schedules would buckle, and at Blue Wing's Manhattan headquarters, alarms would be going off, both digital and human. Somewhere in the waiting area, someone's phone chimed with a breaking news alert. Charles caught the headline reflected on a screen. Blue Wing Air suffers sudden systems failure. Flights delayed nationwide. He closed his eyes for a moment. Was this justice or just a necessary storm? He remembered his father's words, spoken on long ago nights when the world seemed unbearably cruel. Son, sometimes the only way to fix a system is to stop it cold. Let them feel the loss, and they'll finally listen. Charles straightened in his seat, the old resolve settling back into his bones. No matter how many times he'd tried to avoid this, tonight he would not let himself, or what he believed in, be walked over for the sake of comfort. A familiar vibration in his pocket, an incoming call, this time from a number labeled DHS, Direct. Charles answered, voice calm. Mr. Remington, we've received word of your red protocol activation. Is there an immediate threat? No threat, Charles replied, except to the dignity of every person who's ever been told they don't belong. I'm making this a matter of principle, and I expect Blue Wing's board will be calling soon enough. The agent on the other end was silent for a moment, then replied, Understood. We're monitoring the situation. If you need anything, let us know. Charles hung up, hands steady, heart slow but strong. For the first time all night he felt entirely himself, not just a passenger, not just a problem to be handled, but the man who had built Remtech on the idea that respect must be earned but never begged for. He glanced down at his old Navy pin and let his hand rest there. Across the world, planes were pausing, meetings were being called, and people in high places were scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong. Charles didn't need to shout or threaten. He only needed to act in line with the values that had carried him this far. He leaned back and allowed a small, grim smile. Tomorrow, the world would see a new side of Charles Remington, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt, if not vindicated, at least in control of his own story. The first sign was a blinking light on a control panel in Blue Wing Air's Manhattan headquarters. Then another, and then another in rapid succession across terminals from JFK to LAX. By the time the IT supervisor realized what was happening, more than a dozen security feeds had frozen, swipe badges stopped working, and red banners flashed urgent warnings. Suspended. Immediate response required. In the space of minutes, the airline's tightly choreographed world came undone. Pilots radioed the tower for clearance, only to be told to wait. Security protocols offline, boarding delayed. Passengers fidgeted in terminals, eyes glued to departure boards, flickering with the word delayed, spreading in a cascade down the screens. Baggage handlers abandoned luggage carts. Gate agents huddled in clusters, cell phones pressed to ears. In the general waiting area, Charles sat quietly, watching the effect ripple out. He didn't need breaking news alerts to know what he'd set in motion. He could feel it in the subtle change in the room, the rising tension, the confusion in staffers' eyes, the worried buzz among business travelers now searching for answers. A harried Blue Wing supervisor, red-faced and breathing hard, hustled past with a walkie-talkie, snapping, "No, I don't know when the system will be back up. Just keep everyone calm." Across the room, a mother tried to soothe her anxious child, who was clutching a stuffed bear and asking why the plane wouldn't leave. On TV screens throughout the terminal, the usual ads for luxury lounges and credit cards had been interrupted. Instead, national anchors were reading headlines in urgent voices. Blue Wing Air grounds flights at 14 major airports. System failure or sabotage. $900 million, 0 cents. Security contract in jeopardy. Remtech issues no comment. Charles felt no triumph in the chaos, only a weighty sense of responsibility. His actions had set off a domino effect that stretched far beyond his own humiliation. Now, it wasn't just him. It was thousands of passengers stranded, schedules upended, a whole industry forced to stop and reckon with a single point of failure. He thought again of his Navy days, of drills where one misstep could throw an entire team into confusion. The old lesson rang true. A system is only as strong as its weakest point, or as its least respected person. His phone buzzed with texts and emails from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old colleagues, board members, reporters hungry for a quote. Evelyn messaged with a status update. Lockout confirmed, Skypulse expressing interest. Blue Wing board in emergency session. Across the country, executives in glass towers scrambled to make sense of the crisis. At Blue Wing headquarters, the CEO barked orders while board members demanded answers. Someone finally made the connection. He pulled Remtech. We're exposed on every level. Meanwhile, passengers took to social media, venting frustrations and sharing rumors. Hashtags began to trend. Blue Wing down, Remtech reckoning, respect all passengers. A few users even posted a blurry photo of Charles being escorted from the first-class cabin, already gathering thousands of comments. Some condemned Blue Wing for treating an elderly man with such callousness. Others speculated about the deeper story, their curiosity piqued by the sudden silence from the airline's PR team. Charles sat back, breathing steadily. He'd never wanted to make himself the center of a storm, but he also knew that sometimes justice was loud, sometimes quiet, and sometimes it looked like a system grinding to a halt until someone listened. A young gate agent approached, her face pale. Sir, we're very sorry for the inconvenience tonight. The systems are, well, we don't know what happened, but we're doing our best. Is there anything I can do? Charles offered a gentle smile. You're doing all you can. This isn't on you. She nodded, relief flashing in her eyes, and hurried away to deal with another crisis. As the night deepened, airport officials announced that Blue Wing's flights would be suspended until further notice, citing unforeseen technical challenges. In a nearby VIP lounge, a group of high-powered executives whispered nervously, staring at their phones. The illusion of control, of status and privilege had vanished in an instant. Charles sat alone, but not powerless. The indignity he'd suffered was no longer his alone. It was now a story, rippling across the country, asking hard questions about who deserved respect and what happened when those in power forgot the cost of their arrogance. He looked up at the flickering departure board, then out into the rainy night. He knew that soon, Blue Wing Air's leaders would be forced to face what they'd done, not just to him, but to everyone who had ever been made to feel small. The dominoes were still falling, and for the first time in a long time, Charles felt the ground shifting, just a little, toward justice. At dawn, a tired gray light crept over JFK's runways and into the sleepless terminal. Charles sat where he'd been all night, in a chair near the window, watching rain streak the glass. The airport, usually a place of forward motion, now pulsed with restless energy. Passengers on phones, staff pacing, rumors flowing like a second current through every hallway. He scrolled absent-mindedly through his phone, catching headlines multiplying by the minute. Blue Wing grounded. Nationwide delays after security systems freeze. Passengers stranded as airline's $900.00 M contract hangs in balance. Outrage as elderly CEO ejected from first class. Was it discrimination? His eyes lingered on that last one. It still felt strange to see the word elderly applied to himself, but there it was, side by side with a grainy photo someone had posted. A man in a suit, walking down the aisle flanked by security, jaw set and shoulders straight. Underneath, thousands of comments argued, speculated, demanded answers. As Charles read, his phone buzzed with a new message from Evelyn. "Video's out. You're going viral. Community is rallying behind you. Board requests a statement." He clicked the link she'd sent. In the video, Rachel's voice could be heard, cold and clipped. "This seat isn't for you. Please step aside or I'll have to call security." Gregory's voice followed, loud and dismissive. "He's probably in the wrong place. Some people just don't belong." There was no shouting, no threats. Only the casual cruelty of people confident they'd never be challenged. Charles's own words, soft but unmistakable, closed the clip. "You'll remember this moment." Below the video, hashtags flashed by. Liza's bluing shame. Respect. The elderly. Remtech CEO. The story picked up speed. Major news outlets ran segments with experts on ethics and airline conduct. Local radio hosts debated whether what happened to Charles was a fluke or proof of a deeper problem. Veterans associations called for public apologies. Commentators on social media demanded Rachel and Gregory be held accountable. Somewhere in the midst of it all, the truth of who Charles was came out. Not just an elderly passenger, but the CEO of Remtech, the man whose company underpinned the very security infrastructure Blue Wing now desperately needed. He watched as news anchors explained it to viewers. What makes this case unique is that Mr. Remington isn't just any customer. He's a decorated Navy veteran and the architect behind the very systems Blue Wing Air relies on. Now, his decision to suspend Remtech services has effectively grounded the airline. Charles let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. In the space of one long night, the humiliation he'd endured had been transformed into a reckoning, not just for Rachel or Gregory, but for the entire airline, and not by anything he'd said or done in anger, but simply by the truth coming to light. Messages poured in from every direction, old shipmates, executives, strangers from across the country. Some sent words of outrage and solidarity. Others shared their own stories of being made to feel small, overlooked, or excluded. Charles read them all, feeling a quiet kinship with people he would never meet. One message came from a retired colonel he hadn't spoken to in years. "Saw the news, Chuck. Proud of you for standing your ground. Sometimes dignity is its own victory." Charles looked up from his phone and found the young woman from the night before. She hovered nearby, uncertain. He gave her a reassuring nod and she smiled, seeming braver for it. Just then, a cluster of reporters approached the lounge, calling his name, cameras raised, voices eager for a statement. Charles stood slowly, gathering his things. He didn't relish the spotlight, but he knew the moment was bigger than himself. He faced the crowd, eyes calm. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about respect. It's about how we treat people when we think no one is watching, and what happens when the world finally does." His words, simple and steady, rippled through the crowd. For the first time since the ordeal began, Charles felt his dignity restored. Not by revenge or retribution, but by the honesty of being seen. As the reporters pressed for more, Charles glanced out the window at the rain-washed tarmac. He thought of all the people who'd ever been made to feel invisible and hoped that, in some small way, his story would give them courage to claim their place and to stand tall even when others tried to make them small. Have you ever had the truth come out in your favor after being treated unfairly? Did it change how you see yourself or others? Share your story below. Sometimes justice finds its way in the most unexpected places. Morning broke with more than just sunlight at JFK. It brought consequences. Charles could feel the shift in the air long before the official word arrived. By the time his phone chimed with new messages, the terminals buzzed with the electricity of an industry in crisis. A news alert flashed across every screen in the terminal. Blue Wing Air holds. Emergency press conference suspensions announced. It wasn't just talk. The airline had called every available reporter into a hastily set-up press room, blue banners in the background already overshadowed by the story everyone came for. The CEO's face, usually cool and assured, now wore the pinched look of someone pushed past excuses. He cleared his throat and read from prepared remarks, hands visibly shaking. On behalf of Blue Wing Air, I offer our deepest apology to Mr. Charles Remington, his family, and every customer who puts their trust in us. What happened last night was unacceptable. It goes against our values and our promise to serve every passenger with dignity and respect. He paused, eyes flicking to the waiting cameras. Effective immediately, Rachel Foster has been suspended pending investigation. Mr. Gregory Shaw has been removed from our VIP program and reported to his employer for review of his conduct. We will be conducting a full audit of our training and policies. The words hung in the air, but it was the actions that mattered. A new alert appeared within minutes. Veteran groups call for Rachel Foster's permanent dismissal. Bank issues statement, Mr. Shaw's conduct under review does not reflect our standards. Charles watched from the side of the terminal, Evelyn on the phone relaying more updates in his ear. Socials blowing up, veterans, business leaders, everyday folks, all calling for real change. Blue Wing stock still falling and Sky Pulses moving fast. He felt the weight begin to lift from his shoulders, not all at once, but in small, steady pieces. His own name was no longer the headline, it was the principle, the bigger lesson that now traveled faster than rumor. Passengers who'd watched the humiliation the night before now approached him, some with cautious apologies, others with gratitude or support. An older couple, both veterans themselves, shook his hand and shared stories of being slighted, overlooked. You handled it with more class than I ever could, the man said, voice thick. The young woman from the flight approached again. This time she looked him in the eye. Thank you, she said softly. I wish I'd spoken up sooner. Charles smiled, warmth returning to his face. You did enough. Sometimes just noticing is the first step. He didn't need an audience for forgiveness, but it felt right to accept the quiet apologies and nods of respect as they came. Meanwhile, the press conference footage looped on every TV. Rachel Foster, her face blurred, was seen leaving the Blue Wing offices, head bowed, a box of personal belongings hugged close. Gregory Shaw's photo, suddenly less self-assured, flashed next to headlines about his suspension from the bank. Public opinion was swift and sharp. But Charles didn't dwell on their downfall. He focused on the restoration of dignity, not just his, but for everyone who had ever been told to move along or know your place. Blue Wing CEO ended the press conference with a promise. We will not allow this to happen again. We are committed to rebuilding trust, not with words, but with actions. As the crowd in the terminal thinned, Charles found a quiet corner, alone at last. He reached for his navy pin and held it gently between his fingers. For years he had believed justice was something you earned, one small battle at a time. Today he saw that sometimes justice could be public, swift, and, for once, satisfying. His phone buzzed with a message from the Rimtech board. Standing with you, let us know what you need to move forward. A reply from an old friend in Washington. The right people are finally listening. He let the noise of the world fade, focusing only on the silent victory within. Charles knew that public apologies and news headlines were only the beginning. True change, he realized, would require continued vigilance, more than a single scandal could provide. He stood, ready to go home, but not quite finished. As he looked back at the terminal, Charles felt, maybe for the first time all night, a sense of pride that came not from stubbornness, but from knowing he'd stood firm, not just for himself, but for everyone watching. The following days brought a storm of headlines, meetings, and decisions. Blue Wing Air, reeling from public backlash and the collapse of its operations, was left with no choice but to address the roots of its failure. Charles watched it all unfold from his quiet home in Greenwich, Connecticut, the morning sun filtering through kitchen windows as he sipped his coffee and read the latest updates. His phone rang every hour. Journalists, advocacy groups, industry partners, government officials. Most wanted quotes or statements, a few wanted guidance. But the calls that mattered most were from Remtech's board and from the upper echelons of Blue Wing's own leadership. The tone had shifted from defensive to desperate. They weren't just asking for a renewal of services, they were asking for a roadmap to redemption. On the third morning after the crisis began, Charles received a call from Blue Wing's interim CEO, Judith Raines. Her voice was strained, the weight of a broken company pressing on every word. "Mr. Remington, I want to begin by apologizing again. For everything. Not just for what you experienced, but for what it exposed in us. We've lost public trust. We've lost partners. We want to make this right, but we need your help." Charles listened quietly. It was easy to demand apologies or concessions in the face of crisis. The real test was what a company did next. He replied with characteristic calm, "You need to understand, Judith, that this isn't about me. It's about every passenger you've ever failed, every employee you've allowed to look the other way. Words aren't enough. The system has to change." She hesitated. "Tell us how. What do you require?" Charles leaned back in his chair, eyes on the familiar line of Navy medals on the mantel. "First, Blue Wing must establish a public fund for veterans and underserved travelers, people who are too often overlooked or pushed aside. I want real resources, not just token gestures." Judith was already scribbling notes. "Done. What else?" He continued, "Every Blue Wing employee, from top executives to frontline staff, must complete verified anti-discrimination and equity training. Not a one-time workshop, but ongoing, measured, and public. I want to see quarterly reports on progress, and not just for PR. Publish the findings. Show the world what's changing." "We can do that," Judith said. There was the sound of shuffling papers, the hurried whispers of legal advisors nearby. "And one more thing," Charles added. "Remtech will not restore your security systems until Blue Wing has fully committed to transparency. Every complaint of discrimination or mistreatment must be logged, investigated, and made part of a public record. Audited by a third party, not your own management." A heavy silence lingered. Charles could almost feel the tension across the line as Judith processed what was being asked. "That's a lot. It's going to mean changing how we do everything." Charles's voice was gentle but firm. "If you want the public's trust, you'll have to earn it. The alternative is clear. Remtech will transfer all pending technology and support contracts to SkyPulse. They're ready to take the lead, and frankly, they've already agreed to these terms for their own company." Judith was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "I don't think we have a choice. We'll do it." Charles nodded, even though she couldn't see. "It's the right thing. For your passengers. For your future." The call ended, but the work was just beginning. For the next week, Charles and his team at Remtech worked with independent consultants, equity advocates, and representatives from multiple veterans organizations to draft the terms of Blue Wing's reform. Every item was written with precision. No loopholes, no vague promises. The Honor Initiative, as it was quickly dubbed by the press, launched with a press conference streamed live to millions. Judith Raines stood at the podium, her demeanor somber but resolute. "We have failed our passengers and we have failed our employees. Today we commit to doing better, not just in words, but in action. With the guidance of Mr. Remington and Remtech, we will establish new standards for equity, transparency, and respect across every part of Blue Wing Air." Charles declined the spotlight. He chose instead to stand quietly at the edge of the room, surrounded by veterans, advocates, and a handful of employees from every level of the airline. He listened as reporters fired tough questions, as community leaders demanded accountability, as survivors of similar mistreatment shared their own stories. A recurring theme emerged. People wanted more than apologies. They wanted proof of real change. Behind the scenes, Charles finalized the transfer of Remtech's latest security system contract to Skypulse Air, Blue Wing's rival. The move sent shockwaves through the industry. Analysts declared Skypulse the new leader in both technology and ethics, and their bookings soared as customers sought companies that aligned with their values. Blue Wing's stock, once in free fall, began to stabilize, but only because of the visible steps the company took to address its past. Quarterly reports were made public, naming not only policy changes but also the number of employees retrained, the complaints investigated, and the compensation paid to passengers who'd suffered discrimination. Charles received hundreds of letters, some from airline staff grateful for the chance to do better, others from passengers who finally felt seen. Veterans groups praised the Honor Fund, which within weeks had begun distributing travel grants and scholarships to those who had sacrificed for their country. Not every reaction was positive. Some executives bristled at the transparency. Some longtime staffers resented the scrutiny. There were complaints that the process was too harsh, too public. But Charles didn't flinch. He answered criticism with the same measured patience he'd shown in the Navy. True change is uncomfortable. If you feel exposed, it means you're finally seeing what was hidden. One afternoon, as spring sunlight filtered into his study, Charles received a letter that stood out from the rest. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting was careful. "Mr. Remington, I was one of the people who laughed when you were escorted out of first class. I didn't speak up. I want you to know I'm sorry for that. I see now what silence costs, not just for others, but for myself. Thank you for making us see it. Sincerely, a former Blue Wing employee." Charles sat quietly, reading the note twice. He placed it next to his Navy pin and thought about all the moments in life when he'd chosen to stand tall. Not for attention, not for applause, but because it was the only way to be at peace with himself. A sense of hope, cautious but real, settled in his chest. The system was changing, even if slowly. His story was no longer just about one seat on a plane. It had become a blueprint for what was possible when those with power chose courage over comfort, and when those who had been silenced finally found their voice. Spring finally settled in over Connecticut, the world outside Charles's study shifting from gray to green. It had been weeks since the Blue Wing incident, but the shockwaves had yet to fully die down. Some mornings, Charles woke to the faint ache of old wounds, reminders of humiliation and loss, of systems so slow to change. But other days, he found himself almost buoyant, carried by a tide of small victories and unexpected kindness. The Honor Initiative was no longer just a news headline, it was an everyday reality. Blue Wing's public commitment had forced dozens of other airlines to review their own practices. Even companies outside the travel industry quietly reached out to Remtech for advice on ethics, equity, and public transparency. But for Charles, the true measure of change was never in policy papers or news reports. It was in the quiet gestures, the private apologies, the slow thaw between strangers, It began one morning when the postman handed him a thick envelope with a Blue Wing return address. Charles opened it cautiously. Inside, he found a formal letter from Judith Raines, the CEO, expressing both gratitude and humility for his guidance. There was also a packet of handwritten notes, dozens of them, each from a different Blue Wing employee. Some were brief. "Thank you for standing up. I'm new here, and I thought nobody cared. My dad's a vet. I'm sorry for what happened to you, sir." Others were confessions. "I laughed along that night in the terminal. I regret it more than I can say. I want to do better." A few even shared their own struggles. "I know what it's like to be the outsider. Your story gave me courage." Charles read every word, his heart growing heavier, then lighter with each page. He'd spent so many years believing real change was almost impossible. Too slow, too hidden, too hard to measure. Yet here it was, written in trembling penmanship and the honesty of people trying to start over. Later that week, as he left his favorite coffee shop, Charles was stopped on the sidewalk by a young man in a crisp new airline uniform. "Mr. Remington?" the man asked, voice tentative. "I'm Kevin. I was on that flight. I was the baggage handler by the gate. I saw what happened." Charles smiled gently, letting the man speak. "I wanted to help, but I was scared. We all were. But because of you, they made us sit through the new training. I thought it was just going to be a lecture. It wasn't. The instructor talked about dignity, about what it means to see people, not just passengers. I know I'll do better now. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Charles shook his hand. "Thank you for telling me. The important thing is what you do next." The conversation stayed with him all day. He realized how easily bitterness could grow when you believed you were alone, or that nobody ever changed. Yet here was someone, maybe not the same age as his own grandson, willing to try again. A few nights later, as dusk fell over the Remington home, Charles received an unexpected phone call from Gregory Shaw, the VIP passenger who had claimed Charles's seat and set the humiliating chain of events in motion. Gregory's voice was weary, stripped of its former arrogance. "Mr. Remington, I've lost my place at the bank. I lost a lot of friends. At first, I wanted to blame you. But then I watched the security footage, over and over. I saw how I treated you. I'm ashamed. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I'm starting over. I'm volunteering with the Honor Fund now. I want to help where I can. I hope that means something." Charles was quiet for a long moment, the silence on the line heavy with all that had passed between them. "I appreciate you telling me," Charles finally said. "We all get second chances. What matters is how we use them." After the call ended, Charles felt something in him settle. A burden eased, if only slightly. He didn't need to hold on to anger. In its place grew a quiet hope. It wasn't just Gregory. Days later, Rachel Foster, the former flight attendant, sent a letter. The handwriting was uneven, the sentences simple and honest. "I was wrong. I see it now. I wish I had acted differently. I'm volunteering at a local shelter now, helping people who feel left out. I want to make it right, in small ways. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for showing another way." Charles put the letter on his desk with the others. In the corner of his study was a small folder labeled Second Chances. He added Rachel's note, not as a record of shame, but as proof that change, while rare, was possible. The world kept turning. News cycles moved on. The Honor Initiative became part of the industry's new normal. And yet, ripples continued to spread. Charles found himself invited to panels and summits, but he rarely spoke for long. Instead, he shared the microphone with veterans, with frontline workers, with young people who had felt invisible. Their voices, not his, became the true chorus of change. Sometimes he met people who still carried wounds from old injustices. In quiet conversations, he offered the only wisdom he truly believed. Hold your head high. Let your dignity be your shield. Change doesn't come fast, but it does come one act of courage at a time. On the anniversary of the first Honor Fund scholarship, Charles attended a small ceremony at a local airport. There he met a single mother and her teenage son. Both nervous, both beaming. The son, a first-generation college student, shook Charles's hand and whispered, "Thank you for giving people like us a chance to fly." The moment nearly brought Charles to tears. He saw his own young self reflected in that boy's hopeful eyes. As he left the airport that day, Charles realized something powerful. True restoration isn't just about undoing harm. It's about passing forward the gift of new beginnings. At home that evening, he sat by the window, watching a plane ascend into the violet sky. The world was imperfect, and always would be, but with each note of apology, each act of forgiveness, each new journey, he saw proof that dignity and hope could take flight, again and again. Spring moved easily into summer, and with it came the small, tangible signs that the world, at least the part Charles could see, was changing. The headlines had faded, the airports had returned to their careful, measured rhythms. But under the surface, something different was taking root. A shift in how people saw one another, how companies acted, how dignity found its way into places it had once been denied. Charles noticed it first at the local grocery store, where the young clerk who used to look past him now greeted him with a genuine smile. He heard it in the voices of his neighbors, who asked about the Honor Initiative and whether it might one day reach into other corners of daily life, schools, hospitals, government. But the biggest difference was at the airport. On a warm June morning, Charles returned to JFK. Not as a passenger, but as a quiet observer, invited to witness Blue Wing Air's first annual Honor Day. The terminal was alive with banners and volunteers. Veterans in uniform greeted travelers at check-in. Staffers handed out cards printed with a simple pledge: "Today, I will see you. Today, I will treat you with respect." Charles moved through the crowds with a sense of awe and gratitude. He saw Rachel Foster, no longer a flight attendant but now a full-time volunteer, leading a workshop for staff about bias, empathy, and how a single word can wound or heal. She spoke quietly but confidently, her eyes never shying from the people she once might have overlooked. "We can't change the past," she told the group, "but we can change how we show up for each other now." Some in the group nodded, a few looked skeptical. But Charles recognized the courage it took to keep trying. He lingered long enough to see one of the younger agents, Kevin, the former baggage handler, raise his hand. "What if we make a mistake again?" he asked. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Then we admit it. We learn, we try harder next time. We ask for help." She met Charles's eyes across the room, and he gave her a small, proud nod. After the workshop, Charles met with Judith Raines in a quiet corner of the lounge. The CEO had aged in the last year, lines etched deeper by stress and by effort, but her voice was clear. "It's working, Charles. Complaints are down, morale is up. We're not perfect, but every week someone tells me they feel seen in a way they never did before." Charles accepted her handshake, noting the sincerity. "That's all I ever hoped for. That people would look up from their routines, from their rules, and see the human being right in front of them." They walked together toward the boarding gates. As they passed, a little girl paused to stare at Charles's navy pin. "Are you a hero?" she asked, eyes wide. He knelt to her level. "I'm just someone who tried to do the right thing." That's something anyone can be. Over the weeks, stories began to filter in from all over the country. Other airlines adopted the Honor Initiative, posting their own pledges at every counter. Frontline staff received training. not as a formality, but as an investment in a new culture. Veterans sent in letters of thanks, recounting how travel, once a source of anxiety or humiliation, now felt safer, sometimes even celebratory. Elderly travelers reported new levels of assistance, patience, and care. But it wasn't just the big things. In one story that made the local news, a gate agent named Maya noticed an older man sitting quietly in the waiting area. Instead of walking past, she approached him, offered him water, and asked about his day. When the man confided that he'd never flown before, Maya sat with him, explained every step, and even walked him to his seat. Later, she found out he was a retired teacher who had once taught her cousin, she wrote to Blue Wing. I almost missed the chance to know someone wonderful because I was in a hurry. Thanks to the honor training, I stopped and paid attention. I'm grateful. Charles clipped the article and placed it in his Second Chances folder alongside Rachel's and Gregory's letters. The folder had grown thick, testament not just to failures, but to the courage it takes to do better. He saw a message from Gregory, now months into his volunteer work. I thought I'd lost everything. Turns out, I found something better. There's dignity in helping others get back on their feet. Rachel sent updates from her shelter, sharing stories of people she was helping. Most days, I just listen. Sometimes, that's all someone needs. Charles himself became a sought-after mentor, though he never thought of himself that way. He received invitations to speak at universities, on panels, at veterans groups. He always kept his talks short and simple. The hardest battles are the ones nobody sees, but small choices, apologizing, forgiving, speaking up, can ripple farther than you ever imagine. One afternoon, a group of airline executives visited Charles in Greenwich. They asked for his advice on building genuine accountability, not just reacting to scandals, but making fairness a daily habit. He challenged them. When's the last time you listened to a customer who had no power? When's the last time you admitted a mistake, not just to save face, but because it was right? Systems change when people do. As summer unfolded, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had never set out to become a symbol, but in the faces of people he met, strangers, colleagues, even former adversaries, he saw a growing understanding. Dignity isn't granted by position or privilege, it's earned, shared, and defended, one act at a time. His greatest pride wasn't in the headlines or the awards, which he politely declined, but in the subtle daily evidence of a world growing kinder, more alert to the quiet battles of others. On the anniversary of Honor Day, Charles sat on a park bench at JFK, watching travelers flow by. He spotted a young woman helping an elderly man with his bags, a father kneeling to tie his child's shoes, a uniformed staffer taking a moment to explain a delay to a nervous traveler. He thought of all the people who had reached out over the last year, those who apologized, those who forgave, those who changed, and felt a contentment that went deeper than vindication. The ripples were still moving outward. He smiled as he watched a plane lift into the blue. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better. Have you ever witnessed real change in your community, workplace, or family? Because someone decided to do the right thing? Share your story below. Every ripple counts, and yours might be the wave that helps someone else keep going. Summer's heat softened into golden afternoons, and the world around Charles Remington seemed quieter. He walked the green streets of Greenwich, greeted neighbors by name, and noticed with gratitude how simple kindnesses, holding a door, offering a smile, felt a little more natural these days, even among strangers. The Honor Initiative had faded from national headlines, but its impact lingered, not just in airports, but in countless small places where dignity and fairness were no longer just ideals, but everyday practice. One late afternoon, Charles visited a small community center near his old Navy base, where a ceremony was being held for the first group of honor scholars. students whose lives had changed because of the new fund created in the aftermath of the Blue Wing incident. He sat quietly in the back, hands folded on his lap, as young men and women, some the children of veterans, some first in their families to attend college, shared their dreams at the podium. A young woman, Maria, spoke first. Her father, a retired mechanic, watched with teary pride from the front row. "I used to think people like us didn't get to travel or speak up or dream big," Maria said, her voice clear. "But now I know sometimes the world changes because one person doesn't back down. Thank you for showing us it's possible." There was no need to say Charles's name. The whole room understood. After the speeches, a boy of 12 approached, shy but determined. "Mr. Remington? My mom says you helped fix the airline so people like us could visit Grandma. I want to be a pilot someday. Thank you for making them listen." Charles knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. "You'll be a great pilot if you always remember to listen yourself, and to stand up when something's not right." The boy grinned. "I will, sir." As Charles left the community center, he noticed the building's new plaque by the door. Honor Fund. A gift from those who stand tall. He smiled softly. Titles, applause, even apologies. None of it mattered as much as these small, persistent seeds of change. Back at home, Charles found a letter waiting for him. The handwriting was careful, the return address from a shelter in Boston. It was from Rachel Foster. "Dear Mr. Remington, this year I learned more than I did in all my years as a flight attendant. Every day I meet people who just want to be seen. Some days I still feel the old shame, but now I use it to remind myself what not to become. Thank you for giving me the chance to do better. Rachel?" Rachel added Rachel's letter to the Second Chances folder, now thick with stories of regret, renewal, and redemption. That evening, Charles sat on the porch as dusk painted the sky. He reflected on how far things had come, not just for him, but for so many others. Gregory Shaw still sent updates on his work with the Honor Fund, helping veterans adjust to civilian life. Judith Raines, once overwhelmed by crisis, had emerged as a voice for corporate accountability, regularly consulting with airlines and service industries nationwide. But it was the ripple effect that meant the most. Charles saw it when neighbors looked out for each other, when kids at the park helped newcomers join a game, when his own granddaughter, once painfully shy, stood up to defend a classmate. He realized in those gentle moments that the fight for dignity and justice was not about grand victories. It was about the courage to believe that every small act mattered, even when no one was watching. On the anniversary of the Honor Initiative, Charles attended a modest gathering at JFK. The air was filled with laughter, the smell of coffee and pastries, the sound of children chasing each other past rows of tired travelers. As the new honor scholars were introduced, Charles slipped quietly to the back, content just to watch. An airline executive greeted him, then announced a new tradition. Every year, a seat would be left open on the first flight of the day, dedicated to anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. "A small seat, a big statement," the executive said, smiling at Charles. "To remind us that every journey deserves respect." Charles felt emotion catch in his throat. He thought of all the seats denied, the voices silenced, and the gentle power of a place made ready for the next person who needed to be seen. As the ceremony ended, a little girl with braids handed Charles a handmade card. Inside, in crayon, she had written, "Thank you for helping everyone fly." He tucked the card into his jacket, heart full. That night, as he watched a jet soar past the rising moon, Charles understood that the true gift was not the victory or the vindication, but the knowledge that, with patience and quiet bravery, the world could indeed change. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways you'd never expect, and sometimes simply because one person had refused to be invisible, He smiled to himself, hope blooming like morning light. The gift of flight was never just about reaching the sky. It was about lifting each other, one story at a time.